So again, thank you all so much for being here, and hello. My name is Bradley. I'm an events host at Brookline Booksmith. We are based in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is the first time you're hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy you're here, and we're very happy to have you all join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors and an independent bookstore, of course, through your purchases and your attendance tonight. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series. The series focuses on works of literature and art that center migration, displacement, and the idea of home, with an emphasis on works in translation. The series was founded and is directed by my colleague, Shuchi Saraswat. We host regular events with writers and translators from all over the world. You can keep up with our wonderful fall schedule by visiting the series' page on Brookline Booksmith's website, following the series on social media, and by signing up for our weekly newsletter. My colleague Pierce will be joining us in the chat tonight. She'll be sharing purchase links and information about the home anthology from Two Lines Press throughout the event, so just be sure to keep an eye out for that. The chat and question box are open to everyone, so feel free to make use of those. And just a quick note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from event for partaking in such behavior, just to put that out there. Tonight's event is a celebration of the anthology Home, New Arabic Poems, published this year by Two Lines Press. The second installment in their new Calico series, which is dedicated to capturing vanguard works of translated literature in stylish and collectible editions, which is very true, just based on the stylish and collectible nature of this yearbook. Home is a beautiful collection of 9 contemporary poets from 8 countries across the Arabic-speaking world. The poems collected here orbit around the space of the domestic, as well as the daily intimacies that occur there, which structure our lives. Intimacies that so many of us around the world have become particularly acquainted with during this year. Beautifully rendered into English by some of today's leading Arabic translators, these poems are presented alongside the Arabic originals in a gorgeous bilingual collection that celebrates language and its power to transform even the most familiar surroundings into enchanting landscapes for us to dwell in, even if just for a moment. The event will be moderated by Sarah Coolidge, the associate editor at Two Lines Press. Sarah received her BA in comparative literature from Bard College. She enjoys reading books in Spanish and English, and she writes essays on photography and international literature. She'll be introducing the translators, who we're very, very lucky to have joining us this evening, and moderating the Q&A afterwards as well. In a piece about the anthology for Poetry Society of America, Sarah writes, "These poems ask us to fixate on their words, to let them hang like clothes on a clothesline, taking up space and bringing us closer to places that, though we may never inhabit them, feel like home." It's a sincere delight to have these writers here with us tonight. So without further ado, I'll hand things off to Sarah. Thank you so much for being here, everybody.
Thank you, Bradley. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to the translators who I'll be introducing momentarily. We're going to have a little bit of a bilingual reading or non-bilingual in some cases, but we'll do a little bit of reading from the book and then jump into a conversation, and then of course the Q&A. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to write them in your Q&A box that Zoom has, and we'll get to them in that portion. First, I'm going to introduce Rawad. We're going to go in the order that the collection has published the pieces in. So Rawad Wehbe is a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He studies Arabic literature across historical and traditional delineations. His translations have appeared in Inventory, Words Without Borders, and Doublespeak. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rawad. He can introduce the poet he'll be reading from. Go ahead, Rawad.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And of course, because I've been charged with the task of going first, I'm just going to do a quick obligatory thank you just to Bradley and Shuchi and all the folks at Brookline Booksmith. And Sarah Coolidge, thank you so much for all the work that you've put into this beautiful collection. And of course, there are many translators who are not with us today in this event, but thanks definitely goes to them and the poets who made this collection possible. So thank you all very much. And thank you, of course, to the attendees who are joining us. So I'm going to be reading my translation of a selection of little pieces, little vignettes of a larger collection that belongs to Samir Abu Hawash, who is a Palestinian poet, but grew up in Lebanon and currently resides in the UAE. So he's definitely a poet who embodies this concept of home in its many different manifestations and stations, I believe. And the title of the entire work is translates to One Last Selfie with a Dying World. And it's almost fun to imagine each of these little pieces, each of these little vignettes as little independent selfies that are being taken with this world that's kind of taking place in the background that's in the home. So I'm going to be reading the Arabic first all the way through, and then with my translation following. سيلفي أخيرة مع عالم يحتضر. تكفي أحيانا وريقة شجر محملة مفتاحا إلى اسم يضيع. يكفي بعد أن تملأ الحمام بالبخار أن تنفخ في المرآة كما تنفخ في حساء ساخن حتى تعيد إلى جميع الوجوه الصامتة في غابة رأسك جميع أصواتها الضائعة. واقفا أمام المرآة لا تستطيع أيضا أن تثبت هذا اللهاب الذي يصير سعارا، الذي لا تعرف إن كان يصدر عنك أو عن حيوان آخر على مقربة شديدة جدا حتى الجلد. تسمع هدير حيوات تنهض على مقربة منك، قوب يتحطم في مغسلة الجيران، أقدام صغيرة تطأ الأرض، عيون تحاول ابتلاع الضوء كأفواه أسماك جائعة. وميض لن تحاول هذه المرة تفسيره بالكلمات المعتادة، نظرات عاجزة عن أن تصير وجوها، أيادي عاجزة عن أن تصير لمسات. تنظر إلى العالم الذي لم يكن يوما. هذا شبح يرتعش في خزانة الملابس، هذا شبح آخر على طرف اللسان. في الصباح تعرف أنك ستفعل ما درج الموت على فعله منذ آلاف السنين. تتذكر الخبز والقهوة وروائح أخرى تراكمت على شال الأم أو الجدة، أو الأم والجدة معا في صباحات ماضية. تجلس زمنا طويلا بلا زمن أمام الحذاء، تحاول صداقة مع غبار غير مرئي باشر حياته هنا على غفلة منك. أحاول ليس في رأسي فحسب هذا الرعب، جالس على كرسي المطبخ بين يدي همبرجر المذبحة الضخم، وعلي ابتلاعه بقبضة واحدة. في كل ذرة غبار مذبوح آخر سيأتي، وفي مطبخ آخر أحدهم يخوض نقاشا عائليا بسيطا عن نقص اعتيادي في في الخبز أو الماء أو المرح. الناقص الحقيقي هو البحر، ولكن ماذا نروي عن كل هذا الدم لأيدي أطفالنا الأرق من الماء. So now I'll be reading the translation. So just to add, the process of translating, I had just kind of began from beginning to end as far as I could. And then I shared the translated pieces with Sarah and the rest of the editorial board at Two Lines Press. And kind of in a collaborative way, we decided which selections to pick. And it ended up turning out quite nicely. I mean, because the work itself is about 120 pages of these small vignettes. So there's something in the selection as well. It's part of the translation, I believe. One last selfie with a dying world. Sometimes it only takes a neglected leaf to unlock a name misplaced. It's enough once the bathroom fills with steam to exhale onto the mirror, the way you'd blow on hot soup to give back to all the silent faces nestled in the forest of your head, their lost voices. Standing before the mirror, you too cannot restrain the breathing which becomes feral, unsure if it comes from you or from some other beast looming beside, so close, down to the skin. You hear noises hum into life, bursting nearby, a glass shattering in the neighbor's sink, little feet stomping the ground, eyes trying to swallow the light like the mouths of hungry fish. A flash. You won't bother to explain this time using ordinary words, glances incapable of becoming faces, hands short of becoming touch. You look at the world that never was. This is a ghost trembling in the wardrobe. This is another ghost on the tip of your tongue. Mourning. You know you'll do what the dead have always done for thousands of years. You recall the bread, coffee, and other smells accumulated in mother's shawl or grandmother's, or mingled in both from mornings past. You sit up for a while outside time, facing the shoes. You attempt to befriend transparent dust, going about life unbeknownst to you. I try again and again. This terror is not only in my head, sitting on the kitchen chair with a supersized burger in my hand that I must swallow in a single bite. In every speck of dust, another sacrifice will arrive. In another kitchen, one of them will enter a simple family discussion about the customary shortage of bread, water, or happiness. What's really missing is the sea. But what do we tell our children's hands, hands more delicate than water, about all this blood? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rawad. It was so great to hear that read out loud, and the Arabic as well. Our next reader will be Robyn Creswell. We'll be reading from Iman Mursal. I'll introduce him. Robyn Creswell teaches comparative literature at Yale University. He is the translator of Abdel Fattah Kilito's The Tongue of Adam and Sonala Ibrahim's That Smell and Notes from Prison, both published by New Directions. He is the author of City of Beginnings, Poetic Modernism in Beirut from Princeton University Press. His essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The Nation, and elsewhere. Without further ado, Robyn Creswell.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you to all the attendees for coming. I want to second Rawad's thanks to Two Lines and to Brookline as well. I'm going to read 3 poems. I'll read the first one in Arabic and then in my English translation. It's short. And then the next 2 are a little bit longer. So for purposes of time, I'll just read the translation. So Iman Mersal is an Egyptian poet. She was born in 1966, comes from a little town in the Delta called Mit'adlan. She's published about 4 books of collections of poems in Arabic, and now teaches at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. So the first poem is called Jarasa Sabah, or Morning Bell. So I'll read it in Arabic first. تنفتح العين مثل ستارة مسرح في ظلام تلمس قدمان الواقع لا يحدث صحو وخشب الأرضية له نفس حرارة الجلد تكرار طازج وهذا يوم يضاف إليه ويؤخذ منه سيبدأ عرض ارتجالي عند وصول إلى مطبخ العائلة ربما تكون تلك القهوة السوداء هي جرس الصباح هكذا يستسلم الواحد جائزة العودة سالما من النوم. Morning bell. The eye opens like a curtain, rising. Feet feel in the dark for something solid. Nothing's awake, and the floorboards are skin temperature. A fresh repetition. Today will be one more or one less. An impromptu concert strikes up in the kitchen. Maybe this black coffee is the morning bell. The prize you win for returning safe from sleep. The second poem is called They Tear Down My Family Home. And this is a poem set, I suppose, in Iman's hometown of Mit'adlan, as I said, in the Egyptian Delta, where she's kind of come back to find the following scene. They tear down my family home, as if sledgehammers weren't enough. The demolition men use their hands to tear down the window Jinn used to flit through, and with a kick, the back door, even its memory, is gone. Underfoot, I feel the remains of sugarloaf, orange pips, and the mangoes our furtive visitors hid under black head wraps. They would come after evening prayer, the hems of their long galabeyas brushing across the door's threshold, a door of gifts and sorceresses, now a door to nowhere. The roof that never protected my childhood from the Delta rains has reverted to its old self. A few trees you can count on one hand. Now they're tearing down her old bedroom, casting into the air strands of her still wet hair that slips through the cracks of earthen walls about to become clods of dirt, as if no one had ever rested their back there. Did my mother bathe before bed or early in the morning? Did she leave her hair in the comb's teeth to ward off the evil eye or fire or the stratagems of neighbors? My mother's hair glistens like a gift or retribution. What ties me to her now? I donated her dresses because they weren't my style. If we met, I'd be her older sister. What ties me to her now that her womb is in the ground with her, there under the camphor tree, where early death is close enough to touch with your hand. And the third poem I'll read isn't from the collection, actually, but it seemed to me fitting, since it's a poem called The Idea of Houses. And it was published a couple of years ago in The Nation magazine. I haven't asked their permission to read it, but I don't know that I need it. So this is a poem called The Idea of Houses. I sold my earrings at the gold store to buy a silver ring in the market. I swapped that for old ink and a black notebook. This was before I forgot my pages on the seat of a train that was supposed to take me home. Whenever I arrived in a city, I felt my home was in a different one. Olga says, without my having told her any of this, your home is never really home until you sell it. Then you discover all the things you could do with the garden and the big rooms, as if seeing it through the eyes of a broker. You stored your nightmares in the attic, and now you have to pack them in a suitcase or two at best. Olga falls silent, then smiles suddenly, like a queen among her subjects there in the kitchen between her coffee machine and a window with a view of flowers. Olga's husband wasn't there to witness this regal episode. Maybe this is why he still thinks the house will be a loyal friend when he goes blind, a house whose foundations will hold him steady and whose stairs out of mercy will protect him from falls in the dark. I'm looking for a key. It always gets lost in the bottom of my handbag where neither Olga nor her husband can see me, drilling myself in reality so I can give up the idea of houses. Every time you go back home with the dirt of the world under your nails, you stuff everything you were able to carry with you into its closets. But you refuse to define home as the future of junk, a place where dead things were once confused with hope. Let home be that place where you never notice the bad lighting. Let it be a wall whose cracks keep growing until one day you take them for doors. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn. That was beautiful. I love hearing these readings of the work. I was saying before the event began that it's always so encouraging when you come up with an idea for a collection and work comes in that so perfectly fits. Just to see that, oh, other people are also working on this kind of thing and are excited about this work. So I had seen Robyn at a conference talking about Iman Mursal, and I was very excited to get to consider some of his translations for this. Our third contributor is Hodna Nuernberg, who holds an MA in Francophone World Studies and an MFA in Literary Translation, both from the University of Iowa. Her translations from the French and the Arabic have appeared in Anomaly, Asymptote, Quarterly Literary Review Singapore, Poet Lore, Two Lines, and elsewhere. Nuernberg lives in Morocco, where she serves as an editor-at-large for Asymptote and works as a translator for film and TV. Her co-translation of Raphael Confiant's Madame St. Clair, Queen of Harlem, was published by Dialogos in January 2020. Hodna co-translated a couple poets for this collection, Inez Abbasi from Tunisia and Ahmed Shafi from Egypt. I believe she's going to read some Ahmed Shafi poems for us. I'll turn it over to you, Hodna.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I want to just start by echoing Rawad and Robyn and thanking Two Lines and Brookline so much for putting together this event. And also thanks Rawad and Robyn for your beautiful readings. It was really great to hear the poems out loud and to hear the Arabic. I'll apologize in advance that I'm not going to read the Arabic, but I am going to read the full cycle of 10 very short poems, some of which are excerpted in the so Ahmed Shafi is an Egyptian poet, novelist, and translator, and we worked together on these translations while he was a resident at the International Writing Program, which is in Iowa City, Iowa. And I'll just say that it was such a joy to work with him. And one thing that I've really come to appreciate about translating from the Arabic is so many of the Arabic language poets are translators themselves. And that really makes a difference, I've found, because poets who are translators as well seem to have a deep confidence in their translators and in the process of translation. So I will begin. I'm going to read the 10 poems. 1. It's never easy, and probably impossible, to enter 2 rooms at the same time. How can you enter, say, your house and the train station simultaneously? So everything will always be complicated, so long as I find myself entering wherever I enter, with my unhappy memories and my happy ones too. Most memories, I have 2 arms, held wide open, inviting a dance or offering an embrace. And so, all I have left of that distant village is, there are animals, relatives, tales of the dead, and gossip. Nothing but gossip about the ones who left. 3. My sweetheart, who steps toward the church, and the church always steps back. My sweetheart, who the church clearly knows shouldn't worship anyone. 4. My who left the market empty-handed, bought herself? Well, what about me? 5. Remember, my noble friends, when you liberate our fatherland, leave one small fraction of it, a very little piece, unliberated. It won't hinder the construction of your triumphal arches, but it'll be enough for my own father's soul to find its way home. 6. I smuggled a bottle to an inmate, and now, sip after sip, the doors swing open in front of him, door after door, until, in the end, escape is no longer possible. Doors, doors, endless doors, and prison always on either side. 7. And takes time in return, with a small heart, a bird's heart after all. You cannot love even a little bird. And when he returns to reclaim his heart, he finds it sweating, hot, gasping, as if it too flying. 8. It might not be a tree, but a bird can shit on it. I can scratch my name into it with the blade of my pocket knife. And someday, when plaster crumbles and cinder blocks collapse and it disappears completely, it will look exactly like a tree that no longer exists. 9. My village's day is skies. 10. Some friends owe me books. Some owe nice if they'd pay me back, but all of them without exception, and each time we meet, embraced by the old of themselves.
Thank you, Hodna. That was great. It was great to hear all 10 all together like that. I'm going to open it up now to a little discussion. We'll also, in maybe 15 minutes, take audience questions. So be thinking about if you have any questions other than mine. First, I wanted to open it up to the translators to talk a little bit more about the poets they've translated. They did introduce them a little bit before reading them, but I'm curious how you guys discovered these poets and how long you've been translating them and what the translation process has been like. Feel free to jump in, or I can call on someone, but.
Well, I can go first.
Sure.
So I heard about, I studied and continue to study Arabic poetry. And I think it was in grad school, a friend of mine who was an Egyptian, I sort of asked what he was reading, and he showed me a book by Iman Mersel, and this was quite some time ago now. This is probably 15 years ago. And he said, I think she's the best poet writing in Arabic. And so I thought, well, I should read this. And I did and loved it. And one of the reasons I think why was that she's quite, she was so different from the sort of poems that I was used to reading. As a student, I was reading mostly the kind of canonical poems of modern Arabic literature, most of which are by men, poems from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and which are poems, speaking generally, that are very elegant, that use all the rhetorical registers of Arabic, Fusha, that is to say the standard written form of the language. And there's a certain kind of, they're extraordinary, and they're rhetorically masterful performances. They can be a little bit exhausting. And her poems were just so different. They were sly and personal and psychologically subtle, and they kind of moved like quicksilver, and they were just different from anything that I had encountered. And I was poetry editor at the Paris Review magazine for a while, and when that started, this was in 2010, she was one of and we had to kind of come up with a roster of poets that we wanted to publish. And Iman was really one of the first person that I thought of, and wrote to her sort of out of the blue, asking if she had any work that she'd like to show. And she did, and I started translating it. And she's been a real gift to me as a translator and as a friend now. And she's incredibly patient with my versions and helpful. And she's a very careful reader, but English is not her first language, obviously. And so she, as Hodna was suggesting, it's nice to work with somebody who trusts you as a translator. And so our working relationship, and this is not always the case, of course, has been great. It's been a learning experience for me, and it's been wonderful. So I couldn't really ask for somebody better than her to work with.
You're muted, Rawad.
Yeah. I have something to add to that. Hodna, did you have something you were going to say?
Please go ahead, Rawad, and I'll answer the question after you.
Okay. So just coming from the perspective of someone who's currently in a PhD program also, there's something about, within academia, working within area studies departments or even comparative literature departments, as I'm sure Professor Robyn Creswell is well acquainted with, there's a kind of like canon that emerges, especially that not necessarily a canon, but kind of the curriculum that gets taught if you were to take an intro to pre-modern Arabic literature or an introduction to modern Arabic literature, which, gives itself an image as if it's the current, most up-to-date kind of poetry that's accessible. But what you kind of soon realize when you spend time in a lot of these programs is that, these were considered contemporary and modern when the founders of this curricula were kind of in the earlier stages of their research. So a lot of the poetry that you get exposed to as a student within the American academic system is a lot of poets who are composing in the 50s and the 60s. And, foundational academics like Roger Allen, for example, who kind of instituted the field of modern Arabic poetry or modern Arabic literature as a formidable, object of study within academia, that it kind of seems to end there sometimes. Or when you finish one of these courses, you reach a point where you ask the question, well, what's the current state of Arabic poetry, for example? So this is kind of a question that was always in the back of my mind as I'm going through my studies and doing my academic research. So this kind of question always kind of pops up in conversations. And actually another contributor who's also in the collection, Professor Huda Fakhreddin, was the one who introduced me to Samir Abu Hawash. And in kind of like my quest to, acquaint myself with some of these poets who are composing poetry today, because that's literally what a lot of academics were doing earlier. For example, when Roger Allen was kind of writing his work on modern Arabic poetry and modern Arabic literature, a lot of the authors and poets he was looking at were contemporaries of himself. So it's kind of very interesting to kind of push back a little bit or just push more where that contemporary moment is and kind of ask these questions of who the poets are today that are composing and how can we read these poets in that tradition or as a kind of continuation without kind of becoming comfortable and just stopping at that moment at the 60s or 70s or whenever the kind of the modernist Arabic poetry movement kind of comes to slows down a little bit. So it's really interesting, so Samir Abu Hawash, his first collection of poetry, he publishes it in 1997. So it's kind of really interesting to read his poetry and kind of take it seriously and see where is this new generation of poets, where are they coming from and where are they going? And I find it really interesting, and I think Robyn mentioned this, and I think Hodna earlier as well. These are poets who aren't really taking on these kind of like grand, topics or kind of like this poetry that's meant to be shouted on top of a mountain, kind of defying God or systems or of oppression or things of this sort. They're very internal, inward-facing poems from which maybe these like larger, discussions can be extrapolated from. So these are just kind of some ideas that I had when I was engaging with this poetry and trying to read it within the tradition, but also thinking about where that tradition is going and who are the poets who are composing poetry today.
So I'll answer the question about how I became acquainted with Ahmed Shafii. I met him in, I believe it was 2014, through the International Writing Program, which is the world's oldest and largest international writers residency. And that's in Iowa City. So it brings together writers from all over the world. And he was participating that year. And as a translator, I was getting to know the writers. But I do remember we were at a poetry reading, which there's about 2 or 3 or 4 readings a week in Iowa City because that's the home of the Writers' Workshop. And so we were at this poetry reading, and there was a poet who was reading something, I'll paraphrase the line, it was something like, "And the sand of your bodies is the sand of the Mississippi." And 3 or 4 days later, Ahmed came up to me and he said, Hodna, Hodna. And I said, what? And he said, is there sand in the Mississippi River? And I said, no, it's a mud river. He said, yeah, that's what we learned. And so that's how we made our connection, because, you know, he's pretty sharp. And
maybe it was a surrealist love poem, though. I don't know.
Met each other that way. And can you not hear me? Is my audio not working?
We can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. Sorry about that. But yeah, so I met Ahmed that way, and you know, to sort of connect to what Rawad was saying, it is interesting to think about the sort of generational shifts, or how and to the U.S. And I feel like the international writing program, I was really lucky to get to be adjacent to that, because it does bring writers who are working right now, who are very little known in the US, but you know, they're not only young poets, but they're all contemporary poets. So the poems that I read today were published in Egypt in 2017 in a collection called Sabatun wa Sab'una, which is 77, by a publishing house called Kutub Khan.
Great. Thank you so much for speaking a little bit more about the poets you've translated. Before we jump into audience questions, I just wanted to kind of speak to another element of this collection, because I think we've touched on kind of the contemporary nature of it, and the fact, which was kind of a goal when we first conceived of this collection, which was to really showcase some poets who have not been translated, or who readers may not have read lots of work by. And the other kind of element in there is focusing on the home. And so in our time, you know, working at Two Lines, a lot of us noted that we felt like we had received what we did receive of Arabic poetry, which wasn't vast considering all the languages we receive. It felt like there was kind of a sense of what would Americans want to read about. And I think that's true too of the books you see published, somewhat in the US. It can be very much focused on the themes from a Western gaze, in terms of how do Americans, some imaginary American reader, relate to a certain country, or to the Middle East, or to North Africa. So we were really interested in having some more personal poems selected, and poems that could touch on a space that we felt we hadn't seen a lot done by. And so I was so excited when people started sending in poetry that really did speak to this theme. But I wanted to ask you all about whether your poet focuses primarily on this theme, whether you just kind of chose poems that were of this theme, and how you think it relates to kind of the other contemporary literature you're aware of that's being written right now. And kind of a tag on to that, I know it's already 2 questions or something, but would just be a sense of, is the home political? Are these poems that are totally devoid of politics, or do you feel like the home has become politicized? So a lot of questions, but I really want to open it up in the final question to just whatever of those questions jumps out to you.
Well, I don't know if I can answer all of them, but I'll make a stab at. I'll make a beginning anyway. I was very happy you didn't, choose a theme for a book of Arabic poetry that was like the veil, or sectarianism, or jihad, or something, which are, of course, the the things that not just American readers, but a lot of non-Arab readers are interested in when it comes to the Arab world. I mean, Iman grew up in Cairo, and a lot of her, and lived there until her early 20s or 30 maybe. And her early poetry is very much about kind of a Cairo bohemian existence, let's say, hanging out with other misfits and poets. And there's a kind of, I suppose, beat-like atmosphere to a lot of it. And then in her 30s, she married an American and moved to Canada, which is a very different place, of course, than Egypt. It's very cold, for instance, and she started a family there. And so a lot of her later poems, there's kind of a dividing line between the two volumes, which are really set in this Cairene milieu, and then her later two volumes, which are really about, kind of living outside of your country. And so there's a lot of poems, in fact, about home as a physical, her actual village where she grew up, but also Egypt. And Egyptians are kind of stereotypically I think the Arab people most susceptible to nostalgia for the homeland. And she writes very much against this. A lot of her poems are about kind of resisting the pull of home, in fact, wanting to go back, but not really wanting to go back. There's a classical genre, in fact, in Arabic poetry called Hanin al-Awtan. And these were poems, some dating back to the 8th, 9th century, some of them, in which the poet kind of remembers his homeland, which is usually not, a country, but a place where there's a certain kind of vegetation, there's certain kind of animals, and there's his family and certain kinds of architecture. And it's a poem, it's a clearly nostalgic kind of poem, and it's a poem meant to make the audience feel bad for him, and maybe even for a patron to feel so bad that they give the poet some money out of a feeling of a pity for the poet. That's kind of the classical genre, and there are many, many examples of this kind of thing. And Iman is clearly, she knows this genre, and she's resisting it in various ways, writing about home as a place. So she has a lot of like very antagonistic poems towards the idea of home. But for her, I would just say that, for many modern Arab poets, from Mahmoud Darwish to Abdul Wahab al-Bayati to Barushakar al-Sayyab to famous Iraqi poets, the theme of exile is a very important one, a central one to these poets who were exiled in one form or another, usually for political reasons. And so for them, the question of home and exile is obviously, it's a primarily political one. And I think Iman, along with other kind of more recent poets, what she concentrates on is more kind of the, ironical dramas of living in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, or you don't speak the language entirely well. You notice new things about the place. They remind you of old things, but it's a drama of kind of quotidian everyday life in the place where she finds herself. It's not so much these political dramas of exile and longing to return. It's a much more a much more sort of everyday sort of comedy, and also, an expression of feelings of microaggressions, that kind of thing, of living in a foreign country. That's the experience of living abroad, rather than the grand political one, as Rawad was talking about, of wanting to go back to the place where you were from.
Yeah. One thing that kind of comes to mind, and it's probably on the tip of all of our tongues, the word bait, in Arabic kind of like features in my copy. It kind of just shows up. I mean, the translation of the word home into Arabic is also very interesting, because it can have like political connotations or associations with the homeland, but also the bait is also the kind of synonym for the verse of poetry. And there are many poets who have found their homeland within the Arabic language, within Arabic poetry. Like Adonis, for example, is one poet who comes to mind, who kind of finds his homeland or his space within language itself. And I feel like this is a common thing that comes across, at least in my poet's work. I mean, not my poet, but Samir Abu Hawash's work. I mean, his first diwan is called Il-Hayatu Tutba'u fi New York. So life is printed in New York. So there's a relationship between a space. I mean, I'm not personally sure if he was in New York for some time. I don't know his biography too well. But I mean, this idea that life, this kind of the object of poetry is kind of being printed in this space. And then also his, another one of his works was Laysa hakadha tusna'u al-pizza. You know, this is not how pizza is made. So there's also kind of very comical, I mean, like this idea, I mean, when we think of exilic poetry, there's always this, I mean, of course it's extremely important and it commands our attention. But there's a very interesting shift. I didn't really make the connection until Robyn kind of highlighted it, you know, kind of contrasting the poems that we have here with the poetry of exile. Here we have poetry of home, which also has a bunch of problems and difficulties, and it's kind of painted out very clearly in all the poets' works that we're kind of looking at here. And then even the collection that I'm translating here, I mean, the world as a home for all of humanity, and it's a world that's dying in a lot of ways. And there's something about that death, that kind of elegy for the world, for the elegy for the homeland or for the home as well, that kind of comes through here as well. I find it very interesting, especially, and it's something that we can all relate to with everything that's kind of happening in the world today.
Thank you. I'm glad, Rawad, that you mentioned the Arabic that we printed as a translation for Home, the title. Special thanks to Karim Abu Zaid, who helped edit the Arabic part of this collection, and also helped us kind of come up with, should we have the title in Arabic? Do we want to limit the possible meanings? And he was very helpful in telling us that this had a second meaning of verse in poetry, and we loved that, and definitely we were like, we have to put this here. So it's a little Easter egg in the book. Yes. Hodna, did you want to answer?
Yes, sure. So I'm glad Rawad brought up the idea of language as home, because I think Ahmed Shafii deals with language in an interesting way. So what he explained to me is that, well, first, maybe I should say, if anyone doesn't know who's in the audience, when we talk about Arabic, and when we're speaking about Arabic right now, we are speaking about Fusha, which is the standardized literary Arabic, which nobody speaks natively. So there's always a distance. And this was especially clear to me, you know, living in Morocco. Many people do not feel comfortable reading Arabic aloud. I mean, there's also a high illiteracy rate, but the language that people speak that is their home is Darija. And in Egypt, there's also a dialect, which is Amiya. Of course, there's also in Morocco, there are Amazigh languages, which would be the indigenous people. But Darija is the dialect. Just like in Egypt, the dialect would be called Amiya. And so Ahmed's, one of his projects with his poetry is to bring the Fusha, the literary Arabic, as close as he can to the spoken without doing anything that the grammarians could get him for. So I think it's really interesting that he is trying perhaps to create more of a home, to feel more at home in this language, which can be quite alienating or quite distanced for many people, because you don't live your daily life in literary Arabic typically. And in many other ways, I suppose the home can be political beyond, you know, this role of language. And this is just a little addendum, but I was thinking it's interesting to think about the way public and private space is understood differently in many Arab cultures, and how the home can become a center really of power for women, you know, whereas women in Morocco anyway are fairly absent from the streets and from what we might think of as public life. The home is a place where women can perhaps have a bigger role in negotiating that, especially between generations of women or new additions to the family through marriage. I think there is quite a bit of personal politics there. But get too off topic, so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Oh, I love it. I love the many ways that we can think about home and how broad home can be as a topic. Well, we're about out of time, but I do want to turn to the question in the little Q&A Zoom box. I'll read it out loud in case not everyone can find it. It's from Jennifer, who says, "This may be covered somewhat in the discussion, but I'm curious about the medium of the Arabic language, given that each language has its own things that it does or allows or enables especially well, sonically, syntactically, in terms of diction and or otherwise. Would any of the translators like to chime in on what the poets writing in Arabic here are doing to capitalize on the language that may have proven challenging when rendering the poetry into English?" So I think Hodna was speaking to that a little bit, but I'd love to open it up to the rest of you, and Hodna again, if you'd like to talk more about the language. Yeah, I'm curious as well.
I can go again first. Sorry about that. I think one of the things to say is just to note that there's been a very profound transformation in Arabic poetry since the 1950s in terms of the use of meter, the use of poetic meter. And it used to be the case, it was the case in fact for 1400 years or so, that Arabic poetry was basically written in one of 16 classical meters. And there were exceptions to this rule, but it really was the standard for since the pre-Islamic period up until the early 1950s. And even in the 1950s, most poetry was still written in a meter, even if it wasn't written in a certain kind of classical form. It was beginning in the 50s that Arab poets began to write either in kind of broken up meters or in unmetered poetry. This is a very, very recent development. There are exceptions earlier in the 20th century and even in the 19th century, but it was a marginal phenomenon, I would say. And I think all of the poets that we're writing are writing in unmetered verse. Even if there's lineation, there's not meter. And one of the things that the reasons for this is precisely what Hodna is talking about, which is a kind of a growing proximity of the written language, which is only a written language, which can be spoken, but is not something that you'd speak outside of formal context. A kind of growing proximity between the written language and something like the spoken language, so it's you can think of Wordsworth and the language, the ordinary speech that they're trying to get into those lyric poems. Something like that process is generally taking place over the course of the last 70 years in Arabic, where poetry is becoming more and more prosified one way or another, less and less formal. And this is a very important transformation, and has meant that some lovers of Arabic poetry actually say, I grew up reading classical poetry, and the stuff that's being written now in Arabic is not poetry that I recognize as even being poetry, really. So I think there's a way in which this has helped English language translators, which is that English is I mean, English poetry has been for a very long time so closely linked to the vernacular and to spoken language. I mean, this has been the case, not, you know, in American poetry, this is something that Whitman talks a lot about, and he's continuing a line that stretches much further back, probably at least to the Romantics, where we really are kind of thinking of poetry as something which approximates something like the language that we speak all the time. And this means that more recent Arabic poetry actually feels like, at least, that it's a little bit more accessible to us as English language translators, because we're not reaching for those really high rhetorical registers that you would to even translate a poem by somebody like Adonis or Mahmoud Darwish writing in the 60s and 70s, where when you put it into English, there's a real danger of it just sounding stilted and kind of Victorian and faux Victorian and stiff. And this poetry can be a little bit more flexible and prosified in a good way. I mean, I think that it lends itself to that. And I think part of that, frankly, not all of it, but part of it is approaching the spoken language, and part of it is that these poets have also been reading foreign poetries and have been and are taking them in some cases as their models, even including English language poetry. So there's been a general, I think, drawing closer of a lot of poetries. They're still distinct in all sorts of interesting ways, generically and otherwise. But that has been, I think it has been helpful, actually, for us as translators as a way of getting Arabic into English. It certainly has been the case, I think, with Iman. There have been other problems too, but I've been talking too long. So Rawad and Hodna, go on.
Hodna, would you like to go first? I think you're muted, or
Please.
Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, everything that Robyn said is really, really important to kind of keep in mind. I mean, the one thing that's among many things that was just mentioned was this idea that, a lot of this, the prosification of Arabic poetry, and this, it is true that so much, the reception of poetry that's composed in such a manner, in a lot of ways, is not often received as poetry. And particularly with my experience with Samir Abu Hawash, when kind of sharing it with friends, I kind of encountered this, with reading this poetry, saying, well, this isn't poetry. And that always brings up the conversation of, well, what is poetry? And it's very interesting to kind of reinvestigate that question with every poet that you're reading, and the kind of poetic language that an individual poet is creating within their own repertoire, within their own works. And trying not to speak so much about the tradition, but just speaking about Samir Abu Hawash, is that when there's something about reading a poet's entire works or many of their works, kind of like language begins to emerge, and this kind of creation of a new poetic language that's clearly, has broken from kind of the conceptions of meter, but then kind of music begins to emerge as well. And I think that was one of the things I was also grappling with when it came to translating this work. What kind of sounds are emerging? And I agree with this. It's kind of not having to think about the traditional Arabic meters when it comes to translating Arabic poetry, in a lot of ways does liberate the translator in a certain way. Gives her the ability to kind of think outside of the box with what sounds good in English, and in a different way. And I've heard this time and again amongst other graduate students and just readers of translated Arabic poetry, is that it's time for there to be good sounding translated Arabic poetry out there that's accessible. And I'm not just saying this because of this collection, but I really think that's something that gets achieved here. And I don't know if it has something to do with with just the idea that the way that Arabic poetry has transformed has kind of dovetailed with the capabilities of what's possible with translators, or if it's that there is this kind of push between now it's time for translators to work and bring out poetry that sounds good as well in translation. And I mean, there's a lot of thoughts here, and I feel like my response is a bit jumbled, but those are just some ideas that I've had. Yeah.
So do we have time for me to add something, or shall I pass?
I think you can say something.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll try to be succinct. And I think the question that we had was sort of asked about what does Arabic do as a language? And I'm certainly not the most qualified to answer this because I'm not an Arabic linguist. But some things that maybe people in the audience might not know and would be interested to know is that Arabic is, I believe, similar to Hebrew based on a consonantal root system. So if you didn't know this, I think this is so cool. There's, most words will have 3 consonants that are the root that carry a certain meaning. So oftentimes when you're just starting to learn Arabic, you'll get the example of Jarasa, which has something to do with studying. So udaris, I study, madrasa, the school, etc. So I think Arabic has these connections you can make, and it's got such a long history that there's different registers and different words that you can trace the roots back in a really interesting way. And you know, so then there's a lot of alliteration that becomes possible. And also Arabic uses case markings. Perhaps this is like Russian or Polish that, you know, un or in, these are just markings at the end of the words that indicate their grammatical role. Makes it possible to have a lot of repeated sounds or rhyming or a certain rhythm that can sometimes be almost incantory, if I pronounced that correctly. So that's a really exciting thing about Arabic that can be very frustrating if you are dealing with poetry that really makes use of these features of the language, because that's very hard to render in English, which perhaps is why, you know, I do tend more towards almost prose-like poetry. So was I going to say something else? I don't think I am. So that's all. Thank you very much. And correct me if I misrepresented anything about Arabic, please, Robyn and Rawad.
Did great.
It's a wonderful description. But if I maybe just one thing to add, I mean, that's exactly, I wish I thought of that as well. I mean, that facilitates the translation in such an interesting way, kind of gives a lot of liberty. I had a little bit of anxiety that if, you know, a bilingual reader looked at my Arabic, and sometimes they would say, hey, that verb, you mistook that. It's actually a noun in the Arabic. But what I was actually doing, I was kind of thinking about just, you know, I really try to capitalize, for lack of a better term, on that you know, the trilateral root system as a way to, as a springboard for my translation.
Wow. That's so enlightening and sparks so many more questions that I wish we had time for. Unfortunately, in these times, we can't all go get a drink afterwards and keep talking about this, but it was so great to talk to all of you. And thanks so much to the Brookline Booksmith. As a Boston area native, I grew up going there and love you guys. So thanks so much.
And thanks to all of you, to Rawad, Hodna, and Robyn for being here for this lovely, really wonderful and rigorous conversation. I was like taking notes while my screen was live throughout. It was good. And thank you, of course, to everyone in the audience who was able to come out tonight. We really appreciate it. Obviously, there are some wonderful links to check out over there in the chat description, links to buy the book, links for more information on the Transnational series. If you're interested in the bookstore at all, you can find us just at brooklinebooksmith.com. Relatively straightforward. Our next transnational event will be taking place on September 24th at 7 p.m. For Fauzia Karimi's book, Above Us, the Milky Way. So that's going to be a really wonderful event that we're really excited about. So you can find more information about that on the website. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evenings, mornings, wherever you may be tuning in from. So take good care. Thanks again. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone. Bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.